Step back into the fog-drenched streets of Victorian London. Behind the gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages, there were doors that polite society pretended not to see, brothels hidden in alleyways, where women lived lives the history books rarely tell. To some, they were fallen women. To others, they were survivors, trapped in a world where choices were few and danger was constant. A single knock at the wrong door could mean violence, disease, or prison. Yet inside those dimly lit rooms, they carved out communities, secrets, and even strange forms of power. Tonight, we pull back the velvet curtain on one of the most forbidden sides of the Victorian era, and show you what it was really like to be a brothel worker in the age of Queen Victoria. A Victorian packet steamer on the River Thames, shrouded in thick rolling fog. Eleanor Price, a young American woman in her early 20s, stands at the rail in a dark wool coat and gloves, bonnet framing her thoughtful face. Beside her, her stern mother in a modest bonnet looks toward the smoky horizon. The father, gray-haired, straightens his shoulders proudly as the ship nears the dock. Masts and chimneys rise ghost-like from the mist. The atmosphere is cinematic, moody, fog-drenched London, 1857. The crowded wharf of Victorian London, bustling with dockhands, porters, ragged boys shouting for work, and gentlemen in tall hats striding confidently. Eleanor and her family step into the chaos, their American clothes slightly out of place. Coal smoke, mud, and noise fill the scene. The perspective highlights Eleanor's anxious gaze as she clutches her shawl, overwhelmed by the crowd. Inside a narrow, dingy London room, wallpaper peeling, a smoking hearth, one small window opening only to a brick wall. Eleanor's younger brother Samuel, a thin boy, kicks at a mouse hole. Their mother arranges cracked china teacups on a rough table, trying to impose order. Eleanor, weary but observant, sits by the window with her notebook. Candlelight flickers against damp walls, creating a melancholy atmosphere. A young American woman in modest Victorian dress and shawl walks through crowded London streets. Omnibuses rattle by, mud splashing from wheels, costermongers shout their wares, chimney sweeps with soot-blackened faces weave through the crowd. Respectable ladies in silks sweep past, looking down their noses. Eleanor holds a small basket, her posture tense but determined, smoke and fog clinging to her clothes. Interior of a small Victorian bakery, shelves lined with loaves and pies. Eleanor stands at the counter, politely speaking with the baker's wife, who studies her curiously after hearing her American accent. Behind Eleanor, working-class maids wait with baskets. The light is warm but the mood slightly tense, Eleanor's expression showing both politeness and quiet unease. In a dim Victorian room lit by a single oil lamp, Eleanor sits at a small table with her open notebook. Her mother silently weeps in the background, her brother asleep on a straw mattress. The father's chair is empty, a coat hanging abandoned. Eleanor writes a single line with determination. "If I am to be swallowed by this city, I will leave behind words enough that someone, someday, will know I was here." Shadows and candlelight create an intimate, haunting mood. A dim Victorian pawnshop interior, cluttered shelves of tarnished silver, watches, boots. Eleanor's weary father hands over her mother's silver locket while Eleanor, a young American woman in patched dress and thin gloves, watches in silence. Her younger brother Samuel scowls, his cheap blistered boots visible. Her mother stands rigid, bonnet shading her downcast face. The mood is bleak, heavy with quiet humiliation. In a shabby Holborn lodging, the stout landlord with mutton chop whiskers pounds the door with his cane, booming demands. Eleanor's mother offers shawls and linens in vain. Eleanor stands behind, holding Samuel protectively. The wallpaper peels, the hearth smokes, and the landlord looms as a figure of cold authority. The atmosphere is tense, the threat of eviction hanging in the air. A cramped Victorian room near Whitechapel. Damp walls with dark veins of mold, rats scuttling, Eleanor and Samuel huddled together on a thin mattress. Outside the window, a noisy London street with hawkers, drunks, and horses clattering past. The contrast between their fragile warmth inside and the restless chaos outside emphasizes their desperation. Eleanor discovers a single scrap of paper on the table in her father's handwriting, "Gone to seek fortune elsewhere." Her mother slumps weakly in a chair, pale and coughing. Samuel sits on the floor, knees to his chest, eyes wide with fear. Eleanor stands frozen, candlelight casting long shadows on the cracked plaster. The moment is filled with betrayal and disbelief. A bleak Victorian cemetery outside London, common graves marked with wooden stakes. Eleanor in a worn black dress holds Samuel close, his thin body trembling. A small group of poor neighbors stand distantly, avoiding them. Overhead, gray skies press heavy. The image captures grief, poverty, and abandonment. No stone, no name, just survival moving forward. Late at night in their dingy Whitechapel room, Samuel sleeps under a patched blanket. Eleanor sits at a small table by a sputtering candle, her notebook open. Her face is gaunt but determined as she writes, "London devours the weak. I must find another way." Outside the window, vague silhouettes of women under street lamps hint at the choice before her. The atmosphere is intimate, haunting, and resolute. A foggy Victorian London street at dusk. A tall, dark green door with a polished brass knocker gleams against a row of soot-stained brick houses. Eleanor, a 22-year-old American woman with dark hair and pale skin in a patched dress, stands before it holding the hand of her thin, anxious 12-year-old brother Samuel. Both look hesitant but desperate. The mood is tense, filled with fear and fragile hope. Inside a Victorian brothel parlor lit by warm gaslight. Mrs. Harrow, a tall, severe woman in a violet gown with a chignon, inspects Eleanor with the cold precision of a dealer appraising goods. Eleanor stands stiff, clutching Samuel's hand. The parlor looks surprisingly respectable. Velvet upholstered chairs, wallpaper, a glowing fireplace, and china ornaments on the mantel. The contrast between order and unspoken purpose creates tension. The cook, a plump woman with stern features but kind eyes, leads Samuel away down a dim corridor. Samuel looks back over his shoulder at Eleanor, his expression torn between fear and trust. Eleanor stands frozen, one hand half raised as if to reach for him. Gaslight flickers on peeling wallpaper, symbolizing separation and sacrifice. A small attic bedroom under slanted rafters. A narrow bed with clean woolen blanket, a cracked mirror on the wall, a washstand with pitcher and basin. Eleanor sits on the bed in her plain dress, notebook pressed tightly to her chest, eyes wide and haunted. The muffled sounds of laughter and heavy boots echo faintly from below. The mood, fragile safety shadowed by dread. By candlelight at the small desk in her attic room, Eleanor writes in her notebook, her face illuminated by the flickering flame. The words on the page read, "I have crossed the threshold, these words are mine." Her hair is loose, her expression resolved but weary. A faint light of dawn filters through a small window, symbolizing both loss and determination. Victorian parlor scene. Eleanor sits across from a stout, red-faced merchant in a fine coat, his cheeks flushed from brandy. She holds a glass of sherry with steady hands, forcing a soft smile. Behind them, a fire glows in the hearth. Mrs. Harrow hovers in the background, watching with quiet authority. The air feels heavy as Eleanor begins the performance that will change her life. A dim attic washstand with a cracked mirror above it. Eleanor, in her shift, scrubs her arms and shoulders with fierce determination, her skin red from harsh rubbing. On the table beside her rests a small pile of silver coins, gleaming in the gaslight. Her expression is a mixture of exhaustion, shame, and grim resolve. This is survival, stark and unadorned. A dim Victorian scullery with steam rising from boiling water, wooden tubs filled with linens, and women scrubbing furiously. Eleanor, a pale dark-haired young woman, works shoulder to shoulder with the others, her hands raw and red from soap. Mrs. Winters, a stern housekeeper with keys jangling at her waist, oversees the work, her gaze sharp and watchful. The atmosphere is harsh but disciplined. A small attic bedroom lit by a single candle. Eleanor sits before a cracked mirror, pinning curls into her dark hair, applying subtle powder and rouge. Lily, her Irish friend with fiery hair and laughing eyes, leans over to adjust Eleanor's gown, teaching her how to smile softly. The mood is intimate, half sisterhood, half rehearsal for performance. A Victorian parlor transformed for evening business. Heavy velvet curtains drawn, warm gaslight glowing, decanters of sherry on a side table, a gramophone playing faintly. The girls are posed like actresses, one reclining artfully on a sofa, another pouring a drink, another laughing at a gentleman's remark. Eleanor sits with poised grace, learning how to listen and flatter, her expression controlled yet kind. Mrs. Harrow, tall in a violet gown, stands like a conductor overseeing the scene. A warm Victorian kitchen late at night. Eleanor kneels slightly to press coins into the hand of her younger brother Samuel, a thin boy now wearing proper boots and a clean shirt. He looks relieved but avoids her eyes, sensing truths unspoken. Behind them, a kettle steams on the range, casting a homely glow against worn brick and wooden shelves. The mood is bittersweet, love wrapped in silence. Alone in her attic room, Eleanor writes in her notebook by the flicker of a single candle. Her face is thoughtful, weary yet intent, ink smudges on her fingers. The page beneath her hand bears the words, "We are actresses in a play that never ends." The cracked mirror reflects her faintly, doubling the sense of confinement and self-observation. The scene is hushed, contemplative. After a night of raucous clubmen, the parlor is left in slight disarray, empty glasses, rumpled cushions. Lily, the Irish girl, collapses into a chair with flushed cheeks, tugging off her slippers, laughing wearily. Eleanor sits beside her, notebook closed, listening. The gaslights burn low, casting shadows that hint at both exhaustion and unspoken dread. The mood is intimate, edged with foreboding. A richly detailed Victorian parlor with heavy curtains drawn against the London fog, a fire glowing warmly and the smell of sherry in the air. Mrs. Harrow, tall in her violet gown, introduces Eleanor, dressed in a blue silk gown, to Mr. Hamilton, a well-dressed banker in his late 30s with a silver watch chain and confident posture. Lily and Sarah watch from the side, teacups in hand, sharing a knowing glance. The mood is formal yet charged with curiosity. A softly lit Victorian bedroom known as the Blue Room. A fire casts golden light over fresh linens, polished wood, and a vase of roses on the mantel. Eleanor pours sherry with graceful hands, her dark hair pinned in soft curls, her expression calm but watchful. Hamilton sits in the armchair, his gray eyes steady, his manner refined. The scene captures the tension between performance and genuine conversation. Eleanor and Hamilton sit together on the edge of the bed after their encounter. His coat is loosened, his arm draped gently across her waist, their bodies relaxed but their gazes engaged in quiet conversation. A coin rests on the table beside the roses, left respectfully rather than pressed into her hand. The firelight glows warmly, illuminating both faces with a sense of unexpected intimacy. The mood is thoughtful, delicate, and unusually honest. A narrow Victorian bedroom lit by a single candle. Eleanor in her shift smooths her blue silk gown over a chair, her face pensive. The washstand is prepared, fresh linens folded neatly. The hallway clock ticks faintly outside. The atmosphere feels hushed, haunted by thoughts of Mr. Hamilton. A modest attic bedroom with two narrow beds. Eleanor, dark-haired and pale, sits wrapped in a thin blanket, speaking softly. Opposite her, Lily with fiery red hair brushes her hair loose over her nightdress, green eyes sharp with humor. Their faces are lit by dim fire glow, shadows stretching across the cracked plaster walls. The mood is intimate, sisterly, half-whispered secrets in the night. Eleanor and Lily leaning toward each other across the narrow space between their beds, hands brushing gently. The storm rattles the window pane, rain streaking down the glass. Lily's expression softens as she confesses her dream of the sea. Eleanor listens, her eyes tender, caught between longing and disbelief. The room is poor but alive with warmth, rebellion, and fragile hope. The same room moments later. Both women lie back on their beds, laughing softly beneath their thin blankets. Lily's fiery hair spills loose across her pillow, Eleanor's dark curls shadow her face. The glow of dying coals in the small grate flickers against the damp walls. Their laughter feels like a stolen victory against the world outside. A Victorian parlor under gaslight, curtains drawn tight against the snowy night. Eleanor and the other women sit frozen in silk gowns, fear in their eyes. The front door bursts open. Two uniformed constables flank a tall inspector in a black overcoat, frost bristling his mustache. Behind him stands a journalist with a notebook poised eagerly. The atmosphere is tense, heavy with dread. Close view. Eleanor seated rigid in her blue gown, fists clenched in her lap, while beside her Lily in emerald silk brushes her hand lightly against Eleanor's as a secret sign of strength. The fire glows in the grate, but the air feels icy. The inspector's men thunder upstairs in the background, boots pounding on wooden stairs. The inspector looms in the hall until a new figure enters. Mr. Hamilton, tall and composed, snow dusting his black coat collar. His gray eyes are calm but commanding as he declares his name, James Hamilton of Lloyd's Bank. The inspector falters visibly, the journalist shifts uncomfortably, his notebook lowered. The balance of power tilts in a single moment. Mrs. Harrow, pale but composed, gathers the women around a polished wooden dining table. She pours sherry herself, her violet gown still immaculate though her face betrays fatigue. The women listen in silence, their shawls drawn close against the cold. Eleanor looks down into her glass, conflicted, while Mrs. Harrow's sharp eyes linger on her longer than the rest. The mood is solemn, almost ritualistic, survival reaffirmed. Late at night in the shared attic room. The storm howls against the window, snow-streaked glass rattling. Eleanor lies awake in her plain nightdress, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Beside her, Lily pulls a blanket tight, whispering a question, "Do you trust him?" Shadows stretch long across the cracked plaster, the dying fire in the grate casting a faint glow. The intimacy of trust and doubt hangs heavy in the air. A richly lit Victorian parlor, gaslight glimmering off velvet drapes and polished wood. The women sit in their gowns, Lily in emerald silk, Sarah in burgundy, while Eleanor rises in her sapphire dress, her composure taut. Mrs. Harrow, in violet silk, introduces Hamilton, a tall banker in a dark overcoat with a silver watch chain, his eyes fixed steadily on Eleanor. The atmosphere is thick with curiosity and subtle tension. A firelit Victorian bedroom with polished mantel and fresh linens. Hamilton leans casually against the mantel, his glass of untouched sherry in hand, watching Eleanor with quiet intensity. Eleanor stands near the table in her sapphire gown, her posture composed but her eyes guarded. The crackle of the fire and the shadows on the walls create an intimate, precarious mood. Close view of a worn leather-bound copy of Paradise Lost resting on the table. Eleanor's pale hand, trembling slightly, touches the cover. Hamilton, still in his dark coat, watches her with steady gray eyes, his expression softened with sincerity. The firelight gleams on the gilt lettering of the book, emphasizing its significance as a gift for her mind rather than her trade. Later that night, Eleanor sits alone in her narrow bedroom. The single candle flickers beside her as she holds the leather-bound book in her lap, its weight heavy with meaning. Her dark hair is unpinned, falling loose around her shoulders, her face a mix of longing and fear. Outside the window, snow drifts softly against the glass. The scene feels quiet, intimate, and perilous, an image of temptation and fragile hope. A Victorian parlor lit by gaslight, velvet curtains drawn. Eleanor, in a sapphire gown, sits gracefully near the hearth, her composure calm but her eyes wary. Across from her, Lily in emerald silk and Sarah in burgundy whisper to each other, their conversation breaking off when Eleanor enters. The air is heavy with unspoken tension, shadows flickering from the fire. A cramped Victorian dressing room with cracked mirrors and gowns hanging on hooks. Lily, fiery-haired in her shift, confronts Eleanor sharply, her hand pressed against the door as if to bar escape. Eleanor, still adjusting a pin in her dark curls, meets her gaze through the mirror. The atmosphere is raw, lit by a single oil lamp, filled with the warning of friendship tested by fear. A richly furnished firelit chamber. Hamilton, tall and composed in his dark coat and gloves, pauses at the doorway, his hand resting lightly on the frame. Eleanor, in her gown, stiffens visibly, her eyes wide with shock. His lips form her true name, Eleanor. The firelight throws sharp shadows across the room, amplifying the danger of revelation. Mrs. Harrow's office, heavy with ledgers, ink pots, and sealing wax. The madam in her violet gown sits stern behind her desk, her gaze cold and piercing. Eleanor stands straight back before her, hands folded calmly though her heart pounds. The lamplight glints off brass fittings, casting long, strict shadows. The scene radiates authority, suspicion, and the cost of attachment. Closed detail of a worn volume of poetry resting in Eleanor's lap. On the flyleaf, her initials are carefully inscribed in Hamilton's neat script. Eleanor's pale hands hover over the page, trembling slightly. The candle beside her flickers, casting the shadow of her profile on the cracked wall. The book glows with both tenderness and peril, a symbol of dangerous recognition. A dimly lit Victorian bedroom with two narrow beds side by side. Eleanor and Lily sit before a cracked mirror, brushing their hair. Lily, with fiery red hair loose over her shoulders, leans forward, her green eyes sharp as she warns Eleanor. Eleanor, pale and thoughtful, pauses mid-brush, her dark curls half-pinned. Their gazes meet in the mirror, reflecting tension between experience and fragile hope. A richly furnished but stern Victorian office. Mrs. Harrow, tall in her violet silk gown, sits behind a desk cluttered with ledgers and sealing wax, her posture commanding. Eleanor sits opposite in her sapphire gown, hands folded tightly in her lap, her face composed but tense. Gaslight glows against dark wood, highlighting Harrow's sharp gaze as she warns against mistaking patronage for salvation. A private chamber lit by the glow of a coal fire. Eleanor and Hamilton sit near each other, she in her silk gown, holding herself with guarded poise, he in his dark suit and silver watch chain, leaning slightly toward her with quiet sincerity. His hand rests lightly on the chair arm, close but not touching. Between them, silence hums with unspoken truth. The mood is tender, perilous, almost too intimate for the room. Eleanor alone in her chamber after Hamilton's departure. The fire has collapsed into ash, faint smoke curling in the dim light. She sits with Milton's leather-bound book pressed to her chest, her dark hair loose, her expression torn between fear and longing. Shadows stretch across the bare walls, making her appear caught between paths, one leading to safety, the other to unknown freedom. A dim Victorian bedroom lit by a struggling fire. Hamilton stands near the hearth, snow still melting on his dark coat and boots, his posture steady and resolute. Eleanor, in her silk gown, rises slowly from her chair, her expression caught between hope and fear. The atmosphere glows with tension, a moment where fate seems to hang suspended in the firelight. Closed detail: a small leather purse rests on a wooden table, illuminated by flickering firelight. Eleanor's pale hand hovers above it, trembling, but she does not yet touch it. Shadows stretch across the wall, symbolizing the weight of her choice, rescue or ruin in a single object. Eleanor sits alone by the fire, which has burned down to faint embers. She holds Milton's book in one hand and presses the leather purse to her chest with the other. Her dark hair falls loose around her face, her eyes fixed on the dying coals. The mood is heavy, intimate, and filled with indecision, the moment before a choice that could change everything. A narrow attic bedroom with two small beds. Eleanor sits stiffly on her bed, hiding the purse in her lap beneath her shawl. Lily, fiery-haired and sleepy in her nightdress, leans against the doorframe, yawning, asking what's wrong. Eleanor smiles faintly, her expression calm but guarded. The fire is nearly out, and the shadows in the room emphasize secrecy and unspoken truth. A close shot of a small leather purse half hidden beneath folded linen inside a narrow wooden drawer. A faint glow from a nearby candle flickers over it, casting shadows that make it seem heavier than its size. The purse looks both ordinary and ominous, an object carrying the weight of Eleanor's choice. A modest attic bedroom lit by lamplight. Eleanor, in her nightdress, pauses mid-stroke with her brush, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, eyes evasive. Beside her, Lily with fiery hair and a suspicious gaze leans forward, arms folded, her brush set aside. The cracked mirror reflects both women, their expressions divided, one hiding, the other probing. A warm but dim kitchen, a teapot steaming between two women. Sarah, dressed plainly, stirs her cup slowly, her face thoughtful and lined with quiet wisdom. Eleanor sits across from her, hands wrapped around her teacup, her expression tense and searching. The glow of the hearth flickers, illuminating their solemn exchange. Sarah's warning against illusions lingering in the air. A firelit chamber, Hamilton leaning forward in his dark suit, earnest and intent. His silver watch chain glints faintly as his hand rests firmly on his knee. Across from him, Eleanor in her silk gown sits stiffly, torn between yearning and fear, her pale hands clutching her lap. The shadows of the fire stretch long, emphasizing the perilous gravity of his offer. Late at night, Eleanor lies awake in her narrow bed. Lily sleeps soundly beside her, hair spilling across the pillow. Eleanor, eyes open and haunted, presses one hand under her pillow, feeling the purse hidden there. A single candle flickers on the nightstand, illuminating her face caught between hope and dread. The moment feels like a silent prayer, fragile and desperate. A stern Victorian office lit by gas lamps. Mrs. Harrow, regal in her dark silk gown, sits straight back behind a ledger-strewn desk, her eyes sharp as glass. Eleanor, pale but composed in a simple gown, sits opposite with her hands folded tightly in her lap. The polished wood gleams faintly, but the atmosphere is cold, heavy with unspoken threats. The parlor glowing with firelight and sherry glasses catching the light. Eleanor in her sapphire gown leans slightly toward Hamilton, who bends close, his lips forming words meant only for her. His silver watch chain glints as his hand rests on the arm of the chair. Across the room, Mrs. Harrow in violet silk watches from her seat, her expression unreadable but piercing. The moment is a web of charm, secrecy, and surveillance. A narrow bedroom lit by a single candle. Eleanor sits at a small desk, writing intently, her dark curls falling loose around her face. The parchment before her begins with, "Dearest Anna." The light casts long shadows, her hand trembling as the quill scratches. On the floor nearby, a loose board is slightly ajar, hinting at hidden letters beneath. The mood is intimate yet weighted with secrecy. The backyard of the house on a gray morning. Eleanor hangs white linens on a rope, clothespins in her hands. Sarah, plain and steady, leans close, speaking softly, her eyes cautious. Eleanor keeps her face neutral, gaze lowered, but tension radiates from her posture. The bright sheets flutter between them like veils hiding danger. A close-up of Eleanor's drawer, linens neatly folded but straining slightly over the hidden purse beneath. In the dim candlelight, it seems to bulge against the fabric, heavy and accusing. Eleanor's hand hovers above the drawer, hesitant, as though the purse itself breathes with menace. The object is no longer just money, it's destiny waiting to be chosen. A close-up of a small brass key lying on Eleanor's wooden desk, glinting in the guttering candlelight. Beside it, scraps of parchment and an ink-stained quill rest abandoned. The key looks ordinary, yet the light makes it gleam like a sacred relic, carrying the weight of destiny. A dim Victorian office, its fire burned low. Mrs. Harrow sits sternly behind her desk in violet silk, her eyes sharp and merciless. Eleanor, seated across from her in a plain gown, bows her head, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The shadows fall long, making Harrow's figure appear like a judge passing sentence. A subtle image of Eleanor fastening her corset in her narrow bedroom. Tucked carefully in the lining, the brass key presses against her body, its shape faintly outlined beneath the fabric. Eleanor's face, reflected in the cracked mirror, is tense and resolute. The room is dim, lit by a single candle, secrecy heavy in the air. A misty London street at night, rain slicking the cobblestones. A dark carriage waits at the corner of Russell Square, its lanterns glowing faintly through the fog. The driver tips his hat respectfully, his silhouette vague in the mist. The empty carriage door gapes open like a threshold. The scene brims with suspense, every detail whispering of escape or ruin. Eleanor stands in the rain just feet away from the waiting carriage. Her shawl clings to her shoulders, her dark hair damp against her face. Her eyes are wide, caught between terror and longing as she hesitates on the edge of choice. Behind her, the blurred glow of gas lamps. Before her, the carriage lanterns beckon like dangerous stars. The world holds its breath. Rain-soaked London street at night, lanterns glowing dimly through thick fog. Eleanor, shawl clinging to her shoulders, takes a trembling step into a black carriage. The driver holds the door open, rain dripping from his hat brim. Inside, Hamilton waits with hat in hand, his expression filled with relief and urgency. The moment feels suspended between danger and salvation. Victorian constables in long coats hold lanterns up against the carriage, their faces half-shadowed in the misty rain. One officer peers closely into the carriage, light spilling onto Eleanor's damp face, her silk gown visible beneath her shawl. Hamilton sits beside her, posture stiff, his hand clenched in his lap. Tension crackles as bribe money glints in the officer's palm. A modest Victorian flat interior, freshly painted walls, clean curtains, and a fire flickering in the grate. Eleanor stands near the doorway, dripping rainwater, her shawl clutched tightly around her. Hamilton pours brandy into 2 glasses, looking at her with a hopeful smile. The room is warm, but Eleanor's expression is troubled, her eyes distant, already sensing the fragility of her new refuge. Late night in the Bloomsbury flat. Eleanor lies awake in a soft bed with fine white sheets, the fire's glow faint on the walls. Her dark hair spills across the pillow, eyes wide open with unease. In her hand, clutched tightly under the blanket, the brass key gleams faintly in the candlelight. The image captures both comfort and suffocating fear. Victorian office lit by a single candle. Mrs. Harrow, tall and severe in a dark silk gown, snaps a ledger shut with one hand, ink blot spreading across the page. Her face is hard, calculating, eyes glinting in the dim light. Behind her, Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper in a plain cap and apron, stands nervously with hands clasped. The atmosphere is cold, tense, filled with menace. Eleanor walking through a fog-damp London street in a modest Victorian gown and shawl, clutching her parasol. Her posture is tense, eyes scanning the shadows. A cabman tips his hat too slowly, watching her with knowing eyes. Behind her, a girl from Harrow's house glimpses her and slips quickly away. Gas lamps, Mrs. Harrow writing letters at her desk by candlelight, quill poised, her expression sharp with ruthless intent. Sealed envelopes already stacked beside her, wax cooling. Mrs. Winters hovers uneasily, but Harrow's face is resolute. This is war fought with secrets. The room feels like a general's war chamber, strategy unfolding in ink and shadow. Inside Hamilton's respectable Bloomsbury flat, early dawn light falls through thin curtains. Eleanor, wrapped in a shawl, stands anxiously near the window, her face pale with dread. Hamilton, in a dressing gown, holds an open letter with trembling hands, his expression stricken. The fire in the grate burns low. On the bedside table, the brass key glints faintly, symbol of fragile freedom now under threat. A richly decorated Victorian gentleman's club interior, with dark wood paneling, green leather chairs, and dim gaslight. Two well-dressed men sit over port and cigars, leaning close as they whisper, casting sly glances across the room. In the background, other men pretend to read newspapers but clearly eavesdrop. The atmosphere is heavy with gossip and judgment. A foggy London street market in early morning. Eleanor, wearing a modest bonnet and shawl, walks past a bread stall. Two respectable middle-class women whisper to one another while watching her, one hand covering her mouth in scandalized secrecy. Eleanor's face shows quiet shame and defiance as she clutches her basket tighter. The gaslight glow catches the mist in the air. Inside Hamilton's modest Bloomsbury flat, evening firelight casting shadows on the walls. Hamilton, weary in his waistcoat with sleeves rolled up, sits with a brandy glass trembling slightly in his hand. Eleanor sits across from him, shawl wrapped tight, eyes burning with determination. Between them on the small table lies a brass key and an unopened letter, symbols of choice and peril. Victorian hallway lit by a single gas lamp. Mrs. Winters, pale but resolute, stands at the threshold of Hamilton's flat, her cloak damp from rain. Behind her, fog drifts across the street. Hamilton grips the door frame tensely, while Eleanor hovers just behind him, her expression a mix of fear and sudden resolve. The moment feels like a secret alliance being born. Close-up scene in the flat at night. Eleanor lies awake in bed beside Hamilton, moonlight filtering through rain-streaked windows. She clutches the brass key under her pillow, her dark hair spread across the linen. Her expression is fierce, no longer resigned, eyes open, staring into the dark with determination. The sense of a woman preparing to fight back against the city itself. Victorian Bloomsbury flat interior, small wooden table by a low-burning fire, three figures lean close and whisper. A weary banker in a waistcoat pacing with folded hands, a young dark-haired woman, Eleanor, alert and intense, and an older housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, cautious and resolute. Candlelight and gaslight mix, strong rim light on faces, smoke curling in the air, ledgers and a brass key on the table, tense body language, cinematic chiaroscuro, warm amber highlights contrasting with deep shadows, 35mm film look, shallow depth of field, high detail. Close-up of a heavy leather ledger opened on a wooden desk beneath a gas lamp. A folded, scrawled letter peeking from between pages, ink blotches, a quill and spilled seal wax nearby. Texture emphasis, rough paper fibers, scuffed leather, fingerprints smudged in soot. Moody low-key lighting with a single warm light source, dramatic shadows, ultra-detailed, macro lens feel, tactile realism. Nighttime urban scene, a second-floor Bloomsbury flat window shattered by a brick, rain streaking the glass shards on the carpet. A scrap of paper wrapped around the brick with hurried handwriting visible, "Come home, Mary, or you'll both burn." Inside, a startled figure in a silk nightdress recoils. Outside, blurred gas lamps and a shadowy alley. High contrast, dynamic composition, cold blue-gray palette punctured by warm interior lamplight, cinematic motion blur, dramatic tension. Two women under a church portico at dusk. Eleanor in a low bonnet and plain cloak, Josephine, a nervous younger housemaid, exchanging a folded scrap of paper. Both modestly dressed. Josephine's hands tremble as she passes the note. Background, gaslit street, silhouette of Haymarket buildings, soft fog, muted earth tones, painterly realism, sympathetic, non-exploitative framing that emphasizes secrecy and urgency rather than youth. A tidy, shadowed office lined with ledgers and letters. Mrs. Harrow sits upright behind a heavy desk, dark silk dress, sharp expression, ink-stained fingers turning pages. A map of the district pinned to the wall, strings marking routes, a pile of cabman's slips and brass coins on the desk. Cool, controlled palette with steely highlights, authoritative composition, oil painting texture, fine detail, cinematic lensing. A montage-style collage. A gentleman's club parlor with two men whispering over port. A busy coffee house with clerks passing gossip. A Haymarket doorman turning away a patron. Small anonymous notes being slipped under doors. Foggy London ambience, gaslight halos, muted sepia tones, medium-wide composition, cinematic grain and slight vignette, conveys the viral spread of rumor through social spaces. A Victorian Bloomsbury flat interior, small oak table by a misty window, a young dark-haired woman, Eleanor, seated alone, unfolding a crumpled, childish letter. Her face is tense, eyes narrowed, the paper shows shaky handwriting. Beside her, a brass key and a closed leather ledger lie on the table. Pale morning fog through the window softens the background. Warm interior lamplight contrasts with cool daylight. Cinematic, shallow depth of field, 50mm lens, high texture detail, paper fibers, wood grain. Photorealistic. A rain-streaked London afternoon inside a dim exchange clerk's office. A balding clerk with spectacles leans over a ledger as a well-dressed banker, Hamilton, slides him a folded copy of a letter. The clerk's eyebrows lift in shock. Background, rain-blurred sash window, ledgers stacked, a brass inkwell. Moody warm cool color contrast, rim lighting on wet coat shoulders, naturalistic film grain, medium close-up, cinematic storytelling composition. A montage collage. A. Two portly gentlemen whispering over port in a gentleman's club, low-lit with mahogany and velvet. B. A busy coffee house where clerks gossip over newspapers. C. A drawing room where a lady reads a discreet note and looks uneasy. Seamless blend, foggy London tones, gaslight halos, muted sepia and amber palette, painterly realism with subtle film grain, wide aspect ratio for social banners. A narrow London alley at night, gas lamps haloed in fog. A soaked, anonymous boy, age unclear, silhouette only, thrusts a folded envelope into the hands of a woman at a doorstep and flees into the mist. The envelope, held close, shows a single ominous line in ink. The ledger knows your name. Non-identifying, backlit figures, high contrast silhouette, cold blue-gray palette with a warm lamplight accent, cinematic noir, safe framing, no explicit details, 85mm shallow focus. Interior of a modest Bloomsbury flat by candlelight. Three conspirators, Eleanor, young woman Mrs. Winters, older housekeeper and Hamilton, sober banker, lean over a small table covered with scraps of paper and a rough sketch of Harrow's house. Faces lit by a single candle, expressions fierce and determined. Emphasize hand gestures, a folded scrap with childish handwriting visible, tense posture. Low-key lighting, chiaroscuro, oil painting texture or cinematic photo reel, close 3/4 composition. Macro close-up of a thick leather ledger on a dim mahogany desk, heavy brass clasp, pages edged with soot and ledger entries in different inks. A childlike pen blackmail note tucked between pages. Nearby, an ink-stained quill, a loose seal, and a faint smear of fingerprint in coal soot. Tactile detail, textured paper, warm lamp glow creating dramatic shadow, ultra-detailed, macro lens feel. A rain-darkened delivery courtyard behind Harrow's house. A wine cart being unloaded, servants and a distracted deliverman moving crates, Mrs. Harrow calling instructions inside. In the foreground, Eleanor in a bonnet and Winter's work as a human blind. One lifts a crate, the other slips toward the open office door. The ledger is visible on the desk beyond the doorway. Dynamic motion, slightly blurred rain, cinematic suspense, 35mm high detail, safe and non-violent depiction. A nighttime scene, Eleanor clutching a thick leather ledger under her cloak, slipping through a narrow, fog-filled lane between townhouses. Gas lamps glow through mist, a distant silhouette of a carriage passes. Her expression is a mix of resolve and fear, ink smudges visible on her fingertips. Emphasize movement, wet cobblestones reflecting lantern light, cinematic palette, cold blues plus warm lamp highlights, 24mm wide angle for dramatic perspective. A cracked leather ledger with a brass clasp lies on a polished oak desk, heavy and ominous, glowing faintly in warm lamplight. Shadows stretch across the wood, giving the book a presence like a predator at rest. High detail textures, dramatic chiaroscuro lighting, cinematic close-up. A young Victorian woman in a dark shawl cautiously lifts a thick leather ledger from a lamplit oak desk, her face tense, shadows flickering from a nearby fire. Behind her, blurred in the hall, delivery men and Mrs. Harrow's silhouette can be glimpsed. Cinematic framing, shallow depth of field, 50mm lens, high drama. Mrs. Harrow, tall and severe in a dark violet gown, stands in a doorway lit by lantern light. Her eyes are sharp as knives, her smile thin and knowing, directed at Eleanor clutching her shawl. Gaslight and fog spill into the hall, muted Victorian tones, high contrast dramatic lighting. Mrs. Winters drops a wine bottle on the stone floor, red liquid splashing like blood across the flagstones. The sound startles everyone. Delivery men step back, Eleanor tenses near the desk. Shards of glass glitter in lamplight, crimson liquid spreading. Suspenseful cinematic still, photorealistic. Eleanor in a shawl clutching a heavy ledger runs down a Victorian staircase, skirts flying, face pale with terror. Behind her, Mrs. Harrow leans over the railing, screaming. Girls scatter from parlors, frozen in shock. Dramatic low angle, lantern light casting long shadows, cinematic Victorian thriller. Two large doormen loom in shadow before the front door, lantern glow casting their faces in partial silhouette. Eleanor, drenched and desperate, clutches the ledger tightly, eyes wide with defiance. Tense framing, fog and rain visible through the cracked open door, cinematic realism. A foggy London street in pouring rain, gas lamps haloed in mist. Eleanor bursts through the doorway, shawl slipping, clutching the heavy ledger to her chest. Rain soaks her hair and dress, her face fierce with determination. Cinematic wide shot, dramatic motion blur, painterly realism. Mrs. Harrow stands framed in the doorway of her Victorian townhouse, rain pouring, her dark gown clinging, her hand raised as she screams into the storm. Neighbors peek from doorways and windows, fog curling around gas lamps. Gothic, cinematic, moody, Victorian power and fury embodied. A heavy cracked leather ledger lies open on a small oak table in a cramped Victorian flat. Oil lamp glow throws warm highlights across brittle pages filled with looping ink and damning names. A half-empty brandy glass and a pistol sit beside it. Rain-slicked fog creeps along the window beyond. Cinematic low-key lighting, 35mm, ultra-detailed textures, film grain. Three figures around a wooden table. A composed banker in a dark wool coat, Hamilton, a weary middle-aged housekeeper in plain dress, Mrs. Winters, and a drenched young woman in a shawl, Eleanor, leaning over the ledger. Expressions: resolve, worry, defiance. Lamplight carves deep shadows. Steam from brandy rises. Moody Rembrandt lighting, 50mm portrait, high realism. Extreme close-up of a pale hand trembling as it traces the entry Mary, Eleanor. Reliable, discreet, in ornate Victorian handwriting. Ink smudges, paper fibers visible. Reflected firelight and wet eyes blurred in the background. Macro lens effect, tactile detail, somber color palette. Hamilton points at a line in the ledger while Eleanor watches, lips compressed. Mrs. Winters looks on with clenched hands. The page shows Lord A, with notes. The room's wallpaper is faded, the window fogged. Over-the-shoulder composition, cinematic depth, muted desaturation with a warm highlight on faces. A soaked street urchin thrusts a wet envelope into Eleanor's hand on a dim landing. The scrap reads, "The ledger knows your name." Close framing, rain-dappled lamplight catching the boy's fearful face and Eleanor's shocked expression. High contrast noir mood, 85mm shallow depth. View from outside Hamilton's flat through rain-smeared glass. Silhouettes of two shadowy figures lurking by the door, gaslight halo, while inside the ledger glows like a forbidden idol on the table. Composition, voyeuristic, cinematic wide-angle, gothic atmosphere. Hamilton pours brandy for two while Eleanor stands with folded arms and the ledger between them. Mrs. Winters watches from the doorway. The scene captures the quiet pact, danger and determination. Warm highlights on glass, cool foggy window tones behind, 40mm dramatic realism. Hands loading an old flintlock or period pistol on the table beside the ledger. Visible tension in the knuckles, oil and metal textures, brandy glass bouquet. Low angle, hyper-detailed, cinematic close crop, conveys imminent threat. Bloomsbury Street at dawn. Fog rolls low, gas lamps halo in mist, a carriage silhouette passes, distant church spire and the Thames sheen visible. Mood, washed, restless, the city holding its breath. Cinematic wide shot, soft film grain, desaturated palette with single warm point light. Eleanor stands before the ledger on the table, hand flat on the cracked leather, face in half shadow, eyes fierce, set jaw. Hamilton and Mrs. Winters behind her, forming a fragile alliance. The room's lamplight outlines their profiles. Rain streaks the window. Heroic chiaroscuro, 35mm cinematic dramatic portrait. Victorian London alley at night, drenched in fog and rain, gas lamps glowing faintly. A young woman in a dark cloak, Eleanor, clutches a satchel tightly while a well-dressed banker, Hamilton, glances over his shoulder, wary of pursuit. Cinematic, moody, chiaroscuro lighting, 50mm lens. Eleanor and Hamilton pressed against a damp brick wall in a narrow alley, their faces lit by the glow of a passing lantern. Two shadowy men with swinging lamps walk past the alley's mouth, fog curling around their boots. Tense, noir-inspired composition. Winters, older, severe, meets Eleanor and Hamilton in a stable yard by gaslight. Horses shift in the background. Winters holds a stub of candle, her lined face resolute, while Eleanor clutches her satchel protectively. Cinematic chiaroscuro, muted earth tones, smoky atmosphere. Inside a vast, abandoned Victorian brewery, looming wooden vats cast giant shadows in candlelight. Eleanor, Hamilton, and Winters huddle near a single flame, their faces tense, the satchel resting between them. Dust motes swirl in the dim light, gothic and cinematic. Close-up of a damp, nailed poster on a tavern wall. Runaway girl, 23, dark hair, dark eyes, answers to Mary. Eleanor's likeness sketched crudely. A gloved hand tears the poster away. Sepia-toned, Victorian texture, cinematic detail. Eleanor crouches inside a cramped coal shed, clutching the ledger satchel while Hamilton peers through cracks in the wood. Black coal dust smudges her face and shawl. Cinematic low light, claustrophobic framing, suspenseful tone. Close-up of the ledger open on a wooden crate, names inked in neat Victorian script. Eleanor's hand hovers over Lord Ashcombe as Hamilton and Winters watch. Candlelight flickers, shadows long and heavy. Macro detail, tense atmosphere. Eleanor, hood drawn low, slips a folded scrap of paper into the pocket of a printer's young apprentice under the cover of fog. The boy looks startled, she disappears into the mist. Street lamps halo in rain. Moody, cinematic covert exchange. Crowds of Victorian men outside a tavern, cheap pamphlets waving in the air, bold headline, The Double Life of Lord Ashcombe. Arguments erupt, some shouting with outrage, others laughing. Gas lamps glow, pamphlets flutter in the air. Wide shot, dramatic motion. Eleanor stands in the shadow of a doorway, face half lit by gaslight, clutching her satchel. In the street beyond, men argue loudly over pamphlets. Her expression is fierce, defiant, alive, power flickering for the first time. Cinematic portrait, muted Victorian palette. Victorian brothel facade aflame under a foggy night sky, flames licking through roof timbers, terrified women in shawls on the curb clutching blankets, soot streaking faces, gas lamps warped by heat, crowd of onlookers in top hats and coarse coats, dramatic backlighting, high contrast, wide cinematic framing. Narrow cobbled alley with cheap pamphlets plastered on walls and tossed in puddles. Working class men clustered reading a headline, The Double Life, animated arguing gestures. A printer's apprentice slips another bundle into a bag. Shallow depth of field, gritty texture, muted color palette. Young woman, Eleanor, silhouetted against a fog-stitched London skyline, pamphlet-strewn street below where a march chants names. Names? Stale candlelight inside the garret illuminates her tense profile and the satchel at her feet. Moody rim lighting, contemplative close-up. A group of firelit rioters and Harrow's men assembling torches. A nearby row house ringed with smoke. One woman sobbing while another presses pamphlets into a passerby's hands. Chiaroscuro lighting, cinematic motion blur to emphasize chaos. Eleanor and Hamilton on a foggy bridge, ledger heavy and wrapped in oilcloth between them. The Thames reflecting distant fires, silhouetted rioters in the background. Low-angle heroic framing with cold blue tones and warm fire glow highlights. Refined lodgings. A well-dressed banker, Hamilton, stands over a breakfast table reading the Times with headline about resignations. Eleanor in plain shawl in the background listening, face tight. Soft morning light through lace curtains, 50mm portrait feel. Close-up of hands passing cheap pamphlets to a crowd. One hand stained with printer's ink, another with coal dust. Steam rising from a kettle on a street vendor's cart. Gritty, tactile macro shot with high detail. Inside a damp coal shed, Eleanor hunched over the ledger, dirt-smudged face lit by a single lantern. Hamilton and Winters stand guard at the doorway, wary, claustrophobic framing, deep shadows, high-grain texture. Wide panorama of London's skyline at night. Smoke plumes, distant burning buildings, mobs surging down streets toward wealthy terraces, constables forming lines. A smoky, cinematic widescreen composition with dynamic lighting and intense color grading. A rain-slick London boarding house. Door bursting open as Madame Harrow enters in a violet cloak, silver hair streaked, cane glinting in lamplight. Two masked guards flank her, Hamilton aiming a pistol, Winters bracing with a knife. Tense Victorian interior, candlelight and smoke, cinematic chiaroscuro. Close-up of Eleanor thrusting a candle to the open pages of the ledger. Inked names curl into fire, smoke rising, Hamilton and Harrow struggling in the background. Pages burning vivid orange against the dark Victorian room, dramatic contrast, cinematic motion blur. Hamilton dragging Eleanor through a shattered window frame, Winters helping, smoke billowing from the burning boarding house behind them. Neighbors in the street shouting fire, as gaslight and rain reflect off cobblestones. Urgent, dynamic composition. Wide shot of the boarding house consumed in flames, smoke pouring upward into foggy night sky. A smoldering ledger crumbles into ash in the foreground, pages dissolving into embers. Onlookers silhouetted against the blaze, dramatic, symbolic framing. Dawn on a muddy road outside London. Eleanor, bruised and exhausted, wrapped in a shawl on a horse-drawn cart with Hamilton and Winters. The city's smoke haze fades behind them, countryside ahead. Muted pastel sky, cinematic melancholy. An empty violet cloak draped over a chair in a burnt-out ruin, only ash and broken glass around it. Smoke curling through a shattered window. A haunting symbolic shot suggesting Harrow's survival or disappearance, gothic atmosphere. Eleanor walking alone along a rocky New England coast, gray sea crashing against cliffs, gulls circling overhead. Her shawl whips in sea wind, hair loose, posture strong and reflective. Crisp daylight, painterly realism. Eleanor and Hamilton stand side by side at twilight, looking out at waves, his hands in pockets, her expression calm, resolute. Winter's silhouette distant at the farmhouse. Warm coastal light, soft color grading, cinematic stillness. Close-up portrait of Eleanor on the shoreline, sea breeze tousling her dark hair, faint scars and burn marks on her hands. Her eyes determined, steady. Background, ocean horizon glowing with evening light. Strong emotional focus. Symbolic image, ashes scattered by the wind on a rocky beach, fragments of burned paper dissolving into sea spray. In the distance, Eleanor walks forward into mist. Poetic, atmospheric, cinematic composition. London in the 1860s was not only the heart of an empire but also the beating center of its shadow markets. Behind the gaslit facades of Mayfair clubs and Covent Garden theaters stretched an invisible network of houses like Mrs. Harrow's, businesses that operated as much on calculation as any stock exchange. To call it vice was to speak only of morality. In practice, these establishments were part of a hidden economy, a machine finely tuned to extract profit from desire. Every coin that passed through a brothel's parlor echoed far beyond its walls. Mrs. Harrow's ledger, bound in brown leather, revealed more about London than any parliamentary record. Each column was a study in supply and demand. The fees collected from clients were carefully divided. A portion for the girl, a portion for the upkeep of the house, and a portion, quiet, unspoken, for bribes. The constables on the beat did not look the other way for free. An average evening might see 5 or 6 gentlemen of moderate means and perhaps one wealthy patron. A glass of sherry cost a shilling, though the wine was watered down. Time with a girl varied, half a crown for an hour, more if the gentleman demanded exclusivity. For the wealthiest clients, there were special arrangements. Evenings that stretched into dawn, accompanied by champagne and whispered promises. London's brothels did not survive on sailors and laborers alone. Their true lifeblood came from men who by day stood at the very pinnacle of Victorian respectability, parliamentarians in stiff collars, barristers with silver-tipped canes, merchants whose names adorned grand warehouses along the Thames. By night, these men crossed thresholds they would never acknowledge in the House of Commons or in their Sunday pews. They called it recreation, but in truth it was double life, a careful dance between public morality and private indulgence. One evening, Eleanor saw it play out with brutal clarity. A portly man in his 50s arrived at Mrs. Harrow's house, his frock coat reeking faintly of cigars, his watch chain glittering with gold. To the girls, he was Mr. Allen. To the city, he was Alderman Joseph Hallowell, a man who had campaigned loudly for stricter laws against public disorder and who never missed a charity banquet. His speeches thundered about the decay of virtue, while his coins slid across Mrs. Harrow's desk with quiet regularity. "Evening, Mary," he greeted Eleanor with a smile that was almost paternal. "London is too cold without warmth such as yours." Eleanor learned quickly not to react. Hypocrisy was not a revelation here, it was routine. Some clients insisted on aliases, flimsy masks that fooled no one. Others reveled in the contradiction, whispering their real names like secrets, daring the women to hold their reputations hostage. Most carried themselves with the easy assurance of men who knew that society's judgment would never truly touch them. The newspapers hinted at scandal often enough. Gentlemen caught in compromising circumstances. One headline read, though the name was always withheld. For every man publicly disgraced, a dozen others escaped notice. Wealth and influence worked like armor, deflecting consequences. In the gaslit parlor, Eleanor and the other women became confidants to lives divided. They heard confessions whispered over glasses of brandy, political deals, adulterous affairs, debts hidden from wives. One man spoke of bribing a dock inspector to overlook illegal shipments. Another described how he voted against a factory bill while profiting from the very mills it protected. The girls were human vaults, repositories of secrets that could have toppled careers. Mrs. Harrow understood this better than anyone. "Information," she once said, "is as valuable as beauty. Both must be guarded. Both can be sold." It was why she forbade gossip beyond the walls. A careless word to a cabman or maid could unravel the fragile truce between hypocrisy and silence. For Eleanor, the duplicity of these men gnawed at her. She thought of her father, ruined by reckless ventures, condemned by society as a failure. Yet here were men equally reckless, equally corrupt, yet shielded by their titles. They could walk into Parliament by day and into brothels by night, and the world applauded one while pretending blindness to the other. Not all were cruel. Some treated the women with politeness, even affection, as if playing at courtship. They brought small gifts, ribbons, sweets, the occasional book. They spoke of loneliness in their fine houses, of wives who were distant or disinterested. But even in their tenderness lay hypocrisy. Their comfort was purchased, their loneliness relieved at another's cost. The crueler ones were worse, cloaking their demands in the language of entitlement. "You should be grateful," one judge sneered to Sarah after an evening of harsh treatment. "Without men like me, where would you be?" The question required no answer. Everyone in the room knew its brutal truth. The duality extended beyond individuals. Institutions too lived double lives. Charitable societies railed against fallen women, while quietly investing in properties rented to madams. Churches thundered from pulpits while their wealthiest parishioners kept private accounts with houses like Mrs. Harrow's. Respectability was the mask. Vice was the heartbeat beneath. For the women, this hypocrisy was both shield and snare. So long as men needed discretion, the house had value. So long as reputations were at stake, Mrs. Harrow's girls were safe, relatively safe, from the worst of the law's attention. Yet that same duplicity kept them trapped. For who would believe their word against a man of parliament or a magistrate? Who would take testimony from a courtesan when weighed against a judge's oath? One night, Lily summed it up with her usual bluntness. She and Eleanor sat brushing their hair after a long evening, the sound of bristles scraping like a clock marking time. "They condemn us in daylight," Lily said, "and feed on us at night. It's not sin they hate, love. It's seeing sin without their gloves on." Eleanor smiled sadly at the truth of it. The double life of respectable men was not merely tolerated by Victorian society, it was woven into its fabric. Without it, too many pillars would crumble. And so the hypocrisy endured, polished as bright as a gold watch chain, hidden as deep as the secrets whispered in brothel chambers. If hypocrisy was the lifeblood of brothels, medicine was their shadow. By the mid-19th century, venereal disease haunted London as relentlessly as the fog. Men carried it home to their wives, women bore the blame. Physicians came and went through houses like Mrs. Harrow's, notebooks in hand, treatments at the ready, reputations always on the line. Dr. Edmund Price was one such visitor. He arrived twice a month, his black bag polished, his spectacles glinting in the lamplight. To outsiders, he was a respectable man of science. To the girls, he was both salvation and shame. "Ladies," he would announce, his voice calm but detached. "One at a time." Mrs. Harrow insisted on it. "Better to lose a night's profit than the whole house," she would say, her quill scratching across ledgers while the doctor examined the women in turn. She saw health not as mercy but as arithmetic. A sick girl meant lost clients, lost income, lost control. The examinations were brisk, clinical, and humiliating. Eleanor endured them in silence, her gaze fixed on the wallpaper while Dr. Price's hands moved with practiced detachment. He scribbled notes afterward in a ledger bound in brown leather, a secret catalog of flesh and disease, names reduced to initials. Whispers spread that the doctor's ledger was more than medical. He kept records of clients too, or so the girls suspected. Men who had confessed symptoms, men who required discreet treatment before returning to their families. If that ledger ever surfaced, it could ruin half of London's elite. The treatments themselves were cruel. Mercury pills that left mouths tasting of metal. Caustic injections that burned like fire. Ointments so harsh they blistered the skin. "Cure worse than the curse," Lily muttered once, limping back to her room after being dosed. But there was no choice. Untreated, disease ate away at bodies and futures alike. Some men demanded proof of health. "Show me your paper," one merchant sneered, as though Eleanor were a merit market. The doctor issued certificates, signed slips attesting that a woman was sound. They meant little, of course. A certificate on Monday could be false by Friday. But they comforted men who pretended they were cautious. The women bore the real weight. Illness carried stigma sharper than any law. A girl marked as unclean could be cast out in a day. Some tried to hide their symptoms, smearing powder over sores, swallowing laudanum to dull the pain. Others simply vanished, sent away under the pretense of visiting family, never to return. Eleanor learned to read the signs. Sarah's sudden paleness, Lily's trembling hands, Betsy's cough that worsened in the damp. Each symptom was a reminder that their lives balanced on the edge of a medical verdict. Outside the brothels, the debate raged louder. Parliament had passed the Contagious Diseases Acts, laws that allowed police to haul women suspected of prostitution into forced examinations. Respectable men framed it as protection of public health. In practice, it was humiliation codified. Women had no defense against accusation. Once branded, they were marked forever. Men, of course, were never inspected. Disease was always the woman's sin. Dr. Price himself embodied the contradiction. In private, he spoke kindly to Eleanor once, handing her a vial of tonic. "You're stronger than most," he said quietly. "Don't let the ledger reduce you to a number." But he still wrote her initials in the book. He still collected his fee from Mrs. Harrow, pocketing silver for every body examined. Compassion was fleeting, coin was constant. Rumors clung to him too. That he sold his records to certain gentlemen for leverage. That he treated magistrates in secret, keeping their names buried under Latin phrases. That his leather ledger contained enough scandal to topple Parliament itself if ever revealed. One night, after Hamilton's departure, Eleanor lingered in the parlor as the doctor packed his bag. She glanced at the brown ledger on the table, its cover worn smooth from years of handling. Inside lay lives, diseases, and reputations intertwined like knots. She wondered, if she could steal it, what power might it hold? What men might pay to see their secrets destroyed or protected? It was dangerous even to imagine. But the thought flickered like a candle in her mind, refusing to go out. Later, in the bedroom she shared with Lily, Eleanor whispered her unease. "That ledger could destroy them all," she said softly. Lily shook her head. "And us with them. Touch it, and you'll vanish faster than any sickness." The warning was fair. Yet Eleanor couldn't forget the way the doctor's hand lingered on the book, how carefully he guarded it. In a world where men wielded money and law, perhaps the only weapon women might claim was knowledge. The brothel was a place of velvet curtains and whispered promises, but beneath it lay an underworld of medicine and ledgers, of shame dressed as science. And for Eleanor, each page written in Dr. Price's book was another reminder that freedom, if it came, would never be clean. London was never short of brothels. In Haymarket alone, gaslight spilled from dozens of doors, each one competing for the same parade of gentlemen, officers, and merchants. Respectability mattered little in the trade of flesh, but reputation was everything. And reputation was often won, or destroyed, by rivalry. Mrs. Harrow knew this better than most. She had survived not only police raids and gossip, but also the constant undercutting of neighboring houses. Each madam guarded her secrets as fiercely as any merchant protected his ledgers, and each woman sought advantage wherever it could be found. The fiercest rival was Madame Calloway, who ran a house 2 streets away. If Harrow's establishment was known for discretion and order, Calloway's drew men with spectacle. Music spilled out of her windows, and her women appeared on balconies in brightly colored gowns, waving at passing carriages like actresses on a stage. Where Harrow insisted on silence and dignity, Calloway thrived on noise. "Peacocks," Harrow once sneered, watching from her carriage. "They dazzle until the feathers fall off." But Calloway was clever. She cultivated connections with theater managers, who sent actors to her parlor after curtain calls. She invited journalists for free drinks, ensuring her name appeared in gossip columns disguised as society chatter. And when Harrow's house came under police inspection, Calloway seemed mysteriously spared. The rivalry wasn't just for clients, it was for influence. Magistrates and aldermen frequented both houses, their loyalty shifting with whispers and gifts. A single scandal could topple one establishment and crown another. Eleanor saw the rivalry play out in whispers. Calloway's girls sometimes lingered near the market, trading barbs. "Harrow's women wear black silk to hide the stains," one taunted. Lily, quick-tempered, snapped back, "At least we don't sing like caged birds." But Eleanor noticed the sharper edge beneath the banter. Calloway had begun spreading stories, that Harrow's girls carried disease, that her house was under constant watch, that Hamilton himself was keeping one of Harrow's women. The gossip moved like smoke, invisible but choking. Inside Harrow's parlor, the tension grew. Some clients hesitated, glancing around as if judging whether the house was safe. Others asked sly questions about Hamilton, testing Eleanor's composure. "Your banker friend," one merchant drawled, "has quite the reputation these days. I hear he pays dearly for his favorite." Eleanor smiled as though amused, but her stomach twisted. The rumors had Calloway's fingerprints all over them. Mrs. Harrow responded with strategy. She ordered her girls to dress in muted elegance, to pour finer wine, to show extra restraint. "We remind them of dignity," she declared. "While Calloway throws a carnival, we remain a sanctuary." But sanctuary was costly. When Hamilton's name surfaced too often in the gossip mills, Harrow convened her women in the dining room. "We are under attack," she announced, her voice cold as steel. "And I will not lose to that gaudy charlatan 2 streets over. You will hold yourselves like queens, not courtesans. Give them no reason to doubt our superiority." The women nodded, though some exchanged uneasy glances. Survival was one thing, Waging a war of appearances was another. Meanwhile, Calloway escalated. One night, a group of drunken officers stumbled into Harrow's parlor, demanding the kind of wild entertainment they'd grown accustomed to down the street. When Eleanor gently redirected them, one sneered, "Harrow's house is for widows, not men. Let's go back to the music." They left, slamming the door, leaving behind the echo of insult. Lily fumed. "She's poisoning us." Eleanor said nothing, but she knew Lily was right. And she knew that in this world, poison rarely spread without purpose. Within weeks, Calloway unveiled a new weapon, a charity front. She announced that a portion of her profits went to a hospital for poor children. Newspapers praised her philanthropy, conveniently ignoring the trade that funded it. Harrow spat with rage when she read the column. Charity. From Calloway. She feeds orphans with one hand and corrupts their fathers with the other. But the move worked. Respectable men could now visit Calloway's with a veneer of virtue. "I'm supporting the poor," they joked, coins clinking into her coffers. Eleanor saw the toll it took on Harrow. The madam grew sharper, her gaze more piercing, her control more absolute. She doubled the rules, forbidding the girls from speaking of Hamilton, from lingering in markets, from showing the slightest crack in composure. "You are not women," she declared one night. "You are my shield. And if you falter, you will be replaced." The rivalry between madams was not just about profit. It was about power, survival, and the fragile illusion of respectability. For Eleanor, it was a reminder that even beyond Harrow's walls, chains stretched across the city. Two houses, two queens of vice, circling each other like predators. And Eleanor, caught in the middle, realized that escape was not only from Harrow but from the entire web of London's clandestine empire. For every lady in satin and velvet, for every gentleman raising a glass of sherry in the parlor, there were twice as many unseen hands making the house function. The brothel's true lifeblood was not only its women or its patrons, it was the quiet army of servants who scrubbed, cooked, carried, and whispered. At Mrs. Harrow's establishment, they moved like shadows. Betsy the maid, barely 15, swept the stairs each morning, her eyes lowered but her ears sharp. She could recount which client had stayed past midnight, which girl had argued with the cook, which bottle of brandy had gone missing. And Betsy traded her knowledge carefully, for pastries from the baker, for pennies from a cabman, for nothing more than the satisfaction of knowing she had power where others overlooked her. The cook's husband, a stooped man named Thomas, was officially employed to haul coal and fetch parcels. In truth, he was Harrow's messenger. By day, he trudged through the streets with baskets. By night, he carried sealed notes to aldermen, constables, and even rival madams when information proved profitable. The girls joked that Thomas's boots knew more secrets than their diaries. Even the washerwomen who collected soiled linens each dawn played a role. They saw the stains that told silent stories, blood from a fight, lipstick that wasn't from Harrow's house, perfume foreign to the establishment. And they whispered these tales while bending over steaming tubs, their gossip seeping into the wider network of London laundries. For Eleanor, the servants were both lifeline and threat. They were the invisible witnesses who could betray her with a word. She noticed how Betsy lingered whenever Hamilton visited, her broom suddenly sweeping too close to the parlor door. She noticed how Thomas watched her leave for errands, with a gaze that seemed to weigh the purse hidden in her dress. One evening, Sarah warned her outright. "Mind the staff," she murmured as they folded sheets together. "They're paid in wages, but they're loyal to whomever makes life easiest. A sweet word, a coin, a crust of bread, they'll sell your secrets without a thought." Eleanor nodded, though she already knew. She had seen Betsy accept a ribbon from Calloway's footman in the market, the girl's eyes alight with pride. What had she told him in return? The servants' network extended beyond the house itself. Cabmen lined the street, their lanterns glowing like a second row of watchful eyes. Many were on Harrow's payroll. They carried her girls discreetly, ensured clients arrived unmarked, and delivered small parcels without questions. But cabmen were mercenaries. The same man who shielded a girl one night might gossip about her destination the next if a rival madam paid better. Even the errand boys knew more than their years suggested. They carried letters to gentlemen's clubs, delivered flowers to widows, returned books to circulating libraries. Each message was a thread in a vast web, and boys who could not read still understood the value of information. "That one visits Harrow's on Thursdays," a boy might say, pocketing a coin. "And that banker, He's got a girl tucked away somewhere near Bloomsbury. Harrow herself relied on this web. She kept a small ledger not for clients but for favors owed. A constable who looked the other way in exchange for his brother's debts being forgiven, a laundress who warned her when inspectors made rounds, a cabman who once spotted a runaway girl in Camden. These favors were currency as real as gold. For Eleanor, the realization was crushing. Even outside Harrow's walls, the network followed. She could not walk down a street, enter a shop, or accept a carriage ride without risking recognition by someone bound to Harrow through coin or fear. The city itself seemed to conspire in silence, holding her within invisible chains. One night, she asked Lily in a whisper, "Do you ever feel watched even when no one's there?" Lily laughed, though without humor. "Of course. London watches us all. It has 1,000 eyes, maids, drivers, washerwomen. They're the true queens of this city. We live or die by their tongues." The truth struck Eleanor harder than any of Harrow's threats. Escape was not simply about leaving the house. It was about breaking free from the servants' secrets, the cabman's eyes, the washerwomen's gossip. It was about outpacing a network that could trace her faster than the police. And yet, she realized there was also potential. If Harrow could bend the network to her will, perhaps so could Eleanor. Perhaps the very hands that carried rumors could one day carry her to safety, if she could only pay the right price. For now, though, she kept silent, watching the servants move through the house like shadows, each one carrying more power than their humble roles suggested. The house thrived on its women's illusions. But it survived, day after day, scandal after scandal, on the secrets its servants carried in buckets, boots, and whispers. And Eleanor knew, those whispers could either be her ruin or her salvation. Every Wednesday, without fail, the doctor arrived. His boots struck the steps at the same hour, his black bag swinging at his side, his face set in the solemn mask of a man who dealt daily with frailty. To outsiders, his visits gave Mrs. Harrow's house an air of respectability. To the women inside, they were a ritual equal parts protection and humiliation. Dr. Alderton was no fool. He knew why he was paid, half for medicine, half for silence. His reports to the authorities were always immaculate. All girls examined. No signs of contagion. The neat handwriting kept constables from kicking down doors and reassured wealthy patrons that their pleasures were free of risk. But what Alderton kept in his private ledger told another story. He noted each cough, each rash, each suspicious fever. He wrote initials instead of names, but the women knew which letter stood for them. S. Shows signs of weakness. May not last the winter. M. Complains of headaches. Recommend laudanum. E. Appears well, but tension in the voice suggests nerves. The girls called it the death book, though never within Harrow's hearing. To them, it was a reminder that survival wasn't only a matter of keeping clients happy. It was about keeping disease at bay in a world where illness could mean expulsion. Eleanor dreaded her turn. The examinations were brisk but invasive. A stethoscope cold against her chest, questions asked in a voice that brooked no refusal. "Any pain here? Any bleeding?" She learned to answer carefully. Too much truth could condemn her, too little might let sickness fester. Sarah, the oldest among them, explained the unspoken rules. If you feel a cough coming on, drink honey before he arrives. Keeps the throat clear. If you're bleeding, say it's only monthly. He doesn't press too hard if you look him straight in the eye. Lily, bolder than most, sometimes teased the doctor. "Tell me, sir," she once said, perched on the edge of the bed, "do you keep a second ledger for Parliament? Mark down which lords cough louder than they should after paying their visits." Alderton had blushed, snapping his bag shut, but said nothing. The women laughed, though uneasily. They knew the doctor was as trapped in the system as they were. His reputation depended on Harrow's house remaining clean. To admit otherwise would ruin not only the women but him as well. Yet Eleanor couldn't stop wondering, who else might read that ledger? She imagined it falling into the wrong hands. A constable seeking bribes, a journalist hungry for scandal, even Harrow herself using the notes to decide which girl was worth keeping and which was better sent to the gutter. The fear became real one winter when Betsy, the maid, overheard Alderton muttering over his book. "Consumption," he said grimly, tapping Sarah's initials. Not long now. Within a week, Sarah was gone. Mrs. Harrow announced she had been retired to the country for rest, but the girls knew better. Eleanor lay awake nights after that, listening to her own breathing, terrified of hearing a rattle in her chest. The doctor's ledger became a ghost that haunted them all. Some women sought remedies wherever they could. Laudanum was common, a syrupy opiate that dulled pain and blurred sorrow. Others swore by vinegar rinses, mustard poultices, or cod liver oil. Lily joked that gin could cure anything, if you drank enough to forget it. But underneath the laughter was desperation. Eleanor, ever the observer, recorded it in her notebook. We are measured like livestock, kept alive so long as we serve, discarded the moment we weaken. She pressed her pen harder than she meant to, the ink blotting like blood. One evening, Hamilton noticed her tension after Alderton's visit. "What troubles you?" he asked. She hesitated, then spoke with rare candor. "I live at the mercy of ledgers. Yours, his Harrow's. All of them measuring my worth in coin or health. None of them asking what I want." Hamilton looked stricken, but what could he say? He too lived by ledgers, only his carried fortunes instead of fragile lives. The next week, Alderton returned, his bag heavier than usual. Eleanor noticed something strange. Instead of leaving with Harrow's coin, he lingered, exchanging a quiet word with the madam that made her smile faintly. Later, Sarah's replacement arrived. A younger girl, fresh-faced, still believing the parlor's velvet meant safety. The cycle turned again, as inevitable as the clock's chime. Eleanor wrote that night, "The doctor's ledger is not just a record of bodies. It is the measure of how long we are allowed to exist." And she realized something chilling. So long as her name, or her initial, remained in that book, she would never truly belong to herself. London's Haymarket was never ruled by one madam alone. Beneath the gaslight and glitter, the city's flesh trade ran like an underground river, fed by dozens of houses each vying for gentlemen's purses. Competition was as ruthless as any dockside brawl, though the weapons were whispers, bribes, and scandal rather than knives. Mrs. Harrow knew this well. Her house survived because she played the long game. Respectable furnishings, careful ledgers, and silence sold as dearly as silk stockings. But across Piccadilly, another house had risen in recent years, one that threatened the balance. Madame Fenton's establishment, known among patrons as the Golden Rooms. Where Harrow's parlor was velvet and restraint, Fenton's was gold and spectacle. The curtains shimmered, the chandeliers dazzled, and her girls were trained to sing, to dance, to make men feel they were not merely indulging but attending a private performance. Gentlemen left lighter of coin and heavier of reputation, boasting that they had tasted luxury unavailable elsewhere. The two madams despised one another with quiet fury. Fenton called Harrow's place a boarding school for the unimaginative. Harrow, in turn, dismissed Fenton's as a circus with perfume. But insults alone were harmless. What made the rivalry dangerous was the fight for influence. Influence meant patrons with names in Parliament, in banking halls, in clubs where decisions about trade and empire were made. Influence meant protection when constables came sniffing or journalists sought scandal. And lately, Fenton had begun to lure away men Harrow once counted on, promising discretion wrapped in novelty. The women of Harrow's house felt the rivalry in subtle ways. Some nights the parlor sat emptier, the knock at the door later than usual. Whispers floated back from clients who returned comparing the music across Piccadilly or the new French girl at Fenton's. It was an insult more cutting than any slap. Eleanor heard the tension in Mrs. Harrow's clipped orders, saw it in the way the madam's fingers tapped her desk as she reviewed ledgers. A full house means survival, Harrow reminded them. Never forget, another's gain is our loss. Lily mocked it lightly, as if we're pies on a market stall. But beneath her laughter, even she knew the danger. A rival house gaining too much ground could topple theirs entirely. One winter evening, the rivalry spilled into open threat. A gentleman stumbled into Harrow's parlor, drunk on brandy and bravado. "I was at Fenton's last week," he boasted, sprawling across the sofa. "They say your girls are tame in comparison. She lets them dance with nothing but pearls. What do you think of that?" The room went still. Eleanor forced a smile, murmuring some polite deflection, but the insult struck deep. Later, Mrs. Harrow stormed into her office, slamming the door so hard the glass in the cabinet rattled. "Pearls?" she spat. "Does she think gilding vice makes it cleaner? She'll ruin us all if she isn't careful." What Harrow feared was not only the loss of patrons but the attention such spectacle invited. Police tolerated quiet vice so long as it was contained. But flaunted luxury, music spilling into the street, men leaving with flushed faces and loosened tongues, that was provocation. It drew the eyes of reformers, of journalists eager to expose decadence, of politicians seeking easy targets. Eleanor realized then that survival in the brothel world was not only about keeping men satisfied. It was about not being noticed, a paradox in a city that thrived on spectacle. Rumors grew darker still. Sarah whispered one night that a girl at Fenton's had died suddenly, her body removed before dawn, no questions asked. Overdosed on laudanum, they say. But some swear she was beaten by a patron too rough. The story spread like smoke, each telling adding fuel. Yet no scandal appeared in the papers. Fenton had paid dearly to keep it buried. Lily shivered. If Harrow knew that, she'd use it against her. But Eleanor shook her head. Not directly. She knows silence is safer than open war. A whispered truth can do more damage than a shouted lie. And indeed, Harrow began to seed her whispers carefully, suggestions to clients that Fenton's house was slipping, that health checks were lax, that certain gentlemen might be recognized by unfriendly eyes. Within weeks, 2 patrons who had strayed returned sheepishly to Harrow's parlor, muttering about reputation. For Eleanor, watching this dance between rivals was unsettling. It reminded her how little the women themselves mattered in the larger scheme. They were pawns in a war waged by madams for coin and influence, shifted about the board while others chose the moves. That night, she wrote in her notebook, "We polish ourselves like jewels, but we are traded like stones. Our worth rises and falls not by who we are, but by who profits from us." The rivalry between Harrow and Fenton would continue, an endless tug of velvet curtains across the same streets. But for the women within, it was a reminder that even escape into another house was not freedom. It was only a change of master. While rival madams sparred for clients, another force gathered beyond the parlor walls, one that neither coin nor whispers could always silence. London in the 1860s swarmed with reformers, men and women who declared themselves saviors of the fallen. They published pamphlets, preached sermons, and lobbied Parliament, calling brothels dens of sin and their inhabitants souls in peril. To the women inside, such crusades were double-edged. Reformers promised rescue, but their rescues often looked suspiciously like punishment. A girl caught in a raid might find herself sent to a Magdalene home, a bleak institution where prayer replaced pay, where freedom was traded for obedience, and where her name was forever stained. Eleanor first heard of the reformers from Sarah, who had worked a brief stint in Spitalfields before coming to Harrow's. Over supper, Sarah recounted how one winter night the police, spurred by a visiting preacher, had raided a house near hers. They dragged the girls out bareheaded into the snow, Sarah said. Spoon paused midair. One was only 16. They called it salvation. She called it ruin. Lily snorted bitterly. Salvation doesn't put bread on the table. Yet the reformers grew bolder. Posters appeared on London's corners, "The rescue of our sisters." Meetings were held in church halls, where stern men in frock coats spoke of purity while well-dressed ladies wept into lace handkerchiefs. They claimed to fight for morality, but to the women in Haymarket, it felt more like a battle over control. Mrs. Harrow watched these campaigns with wary eyes. "They are not our enemies nor our friends," she told the girls. "They are opportunists. They build their reputations on our backs." She tightened her rules. Earlier curfews, stricter discretion, bribes paid more frequently to the right constables. Survival once again meant invisibility. Still, the reformers could not be ignored. Their speeches reached the papers, and Parliament soon debated new laws. Words like contagious diseases and public morality filled the air, cloaked in the language of health but steeped in judgment. Some bills proposed compulsory medical examinations for prostitutes, treating women's bodies as subjects of law. The thought chilled Eleanor. The weekly doctor's visits at Harrow's house were difficult enough, endured for safety. But the idea of being marched into a public hospital, branded diseased before proven healthy, filled her with dread. At night, she wrote in her notebook, "They speak of saving us, but what they want is to own us, our names, our bodies, our very breath. We are either temptresses or victims in their eyes, never simply women trying to live." The tension grew palpable. One evening, as gaslights flickered against fog, a crowd gathered outside the house. Reformers had marched with placards, chanting scripture and hymns. "Repent," they cried. "Leave this life." The girls huddled at the windows, peeking through curtains. Lily laughed nervously. "Do they think shouting will change anything? If we walked out now, what would they give us? A hymn book and hunger?" Mrs. Harrow, unflinching, ordered the shutters closed. "Let them sing," she said coldly. "They'll tire before we do. Morality fades quicker than desire." But Eleanor could not shake the sight. The reformers' faces burned in her mind, their zeal, their certainty. Did they truly believe they were saving anyone? Or was it themselves they sought to save, polishing their own virtue by parading others' shame? A week later, Eleanor saw the other side. While running an errand in Bloomsbury, she passed the small mission house. Outside, a pale girl no older than Samuel once was swept the steps with slow strokes. She wore plain gray, her hair cropped short, her eyes downcast. Eleanor recognized her. It was Martha, a girl who had once worked briefly under Mrs. Harrow before being turned out. Their gazes met for a fleeting moment. Martha's eyes held no joy, only resignation. Eleanor raised a hand in greeting, but the girl looked away quickly as though afraid to be seen. The mission door closed behind her, cutting her off from the street. Eleanor walked on chilled. Rescue, it seemed, was just another cage. That night, she confided in Lily. "They call it reform, but it feels like erasure. They strip away names, past, laughter. They call that salvation." Lily's smile was thin. "At least Harrow admits what she is. These others," she spat the words, "they lie to themselves. That's worse." For Eleanor, the reformers' campaign revealed a cruel paradox. Brothels exploited, yes, but so did the world that condemned them. Respectability was another form of commerce, and women were its currency. In her notebook, she wrote, "Perhaps one day, there will be a place where a woman is neither sinner nor saint, but simply herself. Until then, we live between their labels, surviving as best we can." The hymns outside faded, but the unease lingered. The battle for women's lives was being fought on streets and in Parliament alike, yet none of the fighters truly listened to the women themselves. And in the parlor of Mrs. Harrow's house, survival continued, measured not in sermons or laws but in coins, in meals, and in the fragile bonds between women who knew the truth. Not every soul in Mrs. Harrow's house was a client or a courtesan. Beneath the satin and sherry, the establishment ticked like a great machine, powered by hands that never touched a gentleman's purse. Servants, maids, errand boys, cooks, kept the illusion polished. And it was through their eyes that the house's secrets often slipped into the wider city. Betsy, the youngest maid, scurried like a sparrow from dawn until midnight. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached, emptied basins with wrinkled hands, and polished boots left muddied by London streets. To the women upstairs, she was half invisible. But Betsy saw everything. She heard laughter muffled through doors, caught glimpses of coin exchanged, noticed which gentleman lingered too long and which left in haste. Her loyalty, however, was always to survival, not to silence. A whispered word to a baker earned her an extra roll. A half-told story to a cabman bought her a ride home when the fog grew too thick. Slowly, she stitched a network of knowledge, scraps of gossip traded for scraps of comfort. The cook, Mrs. Tulliver, was another keeper of confidences. A stout woman with forearms like rolling pins, she had once worked in service for a family in Mayfair before scandal drove her to the margins. She insisted on feeding the house properly, meat stews, thick porridge, crusty bread. "A girl with food in her belly works better," she said, "and looks healthier for the gentleman." But Mrs. Tulliver also listened. As she kneaded dough, she absorbed fragments of conversation drifting from the parlor, stitched together from careless boasts of clients. Which banker feared collapse, which MP kept a mistress in Chelsea, which merchant smuggled goods through India, all filtered through her kitchen. She never used it herself, but she knew its value, and Mrs. Harrow knew she could count on her discretion. Then there was Jonah, the errand boy, barely 15. He carried parcels, fetched coal, ran messages across London's tangled streets. His thin frame slipped through alleys unnoticed, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. He delivered bouquets for patrons, notes for the women, bottles of brandy hidden in brown paper. In return, he collected tips, each coin tucked away for a future he barely dared imagine. Jonah's greatest weapon was his invisibility. Men never looked closely at errand boys, and women assumed his youth made him harmless. But Jonah built a mental ledger of secrets that rivaled Harrow's own. One night, Eleanor overheard him whispering to Betsy, "That one, the gentleman in the gray coat? He's got a wife on Belgrave Square. I saw her name on the florist's bill." His grin was sharp. Knowledge, to him, was power, power he intended to wield someday. Eleanor realized then that survival in the house was not confined to the women who entertained upstairs. The servants, too, lived by a fragile calculus. Silence bought them security, but whispers bought them bread. One evening, after Hamilton's latest visit, Eleanor lingered in the kitchen. Mrs. Tulliver was peeling potatoes, the hearth fire throwing a warm glow on her lined face. Betsy darted in with a tray of empty glasses, humming to herself. Eleanor spoke softly. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Mrs. Tulliver snorted. "And go where? Back to scrubbing sculleries for ladies who look at me like I'm dirt? Here I feed mouths, I keep order. It's not glory, but it's mine." Betsy giggled. "I'll leave one day. Marry a shopkeeper, maybe. Wear my hair up with pins." Her eyes shone with impossible hope. Eleanor smiled faintly, though her heart ached. Dreams looked different depending on where you stood. For Betsy, escape meant a husband and a shop. For Mrs. Tulliver, it meant simply keeping her place in a kitchen where no one asked too many questions. For Jonah, it meant climbing out of invisibility on the ladder of secrets. And for Eleanor? She did not yet know. The truth was this: the servants were the house's quiet pulse. Without them, sheets would remain soiled, meals unfed, errands undone. And yet, because they were not courtesans, they were half forgotten, half despised, shadows who passed unnoticed while carrying entire worlds in their pockets. That night, Eleanor wrote in her notebook, "If the gentlemen knew how much the servants saw, they would tremble. We think ourselves trapped, but perhaps it is they who are most exposed." The parlor sparkled, the clients drank, and the illusion of luxury held. But beneath it all, Betsy's bright eyes, Jonah's quick steps, and Mrs. Tulliver's steady hands wove the fabric of survival. And outside, in the markets and alleys, their whispered stories drifted like smoke, reminding Eleanor that the house was never as closed as it seemed. In the parlor, gentlemen raised glasses of sherry and praised their own wit. Upstairs, silk gowns whispered against bedposts, and coins changed hands with the ease of breath. But beneath the polished veneer of Mrs. Harrow's house lay another unspoken reality: the body's toll. Illness, pain, unwanted consequence. These were not topics for ledgers or polite conversation. Yet every woman in the house carried the knowledge that her body was both her livelihood and her most fragile possession. And so, when whispers of remedy were needed, they did not turn to physicians in Mayfair drawing rooms. They turned to the midnight healers. London swarmed with such women: herbalists, midwives, apothecaries tucked into shadowed alleys. Some were charlatans peddling sugar water as cure. Others knew their craft with frightening precision. To the women of Haymarket, they were lifelines. Eleanor learned of them first through Sarah, who returned one evening with a small brown packet tucked into her bodice. She slipped it beneath her mattress, eyes darting nervously. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. "Pennyroyal," Sarah whispered. "For accidents." The meaning was clear. Eleanor's stomach tightened. The house ran on rules and order, but rules could not prevent the most natural of risks. And when risk became reality, women had few choices: vanish into the countryside, beg Mrs. Harrow for mercy, or seek help in the shadows. One such shadow was Madame Selby, an herbalist whose shop near Clerkenwell smelled of sage and vinegar. She was known to the girls as the Night Mother. She sold tonics for nerves, powders for sleep, and tinctures to regulate a woman's cycle. Some swore she had once been a midwife turned away from hospital practice after refusing to condemn her patients. Lily dragged Eleanor there once under the pretense of buying hairpins. The shop was dim, shelves crowded with jars of roots and bottles of amber liquid. Madame Selby, a woman of indeterminate age with gray hair coiled like rope, looked them over with sharp eyes. "Keep your voices low," she said, her accent rough with the East End. "Men call it witchcraft. I call it survival." Lily bought a vial of laudanum, "for sleep," she said. Eleanor said nothing, but she memorized the shop's door, its crooked sign, the way the bell jingled faintly when they left. She hoped never to return. Yet part of her knew she might. Not all healers worked from shops. Some came to the houses themselves, summoned in the dead of night when fever burned or blood flowed too heavily. Mrs. Harrow permitted it quietly. She preferred her girls remain healthy, but she also preferred her ledgers remain untroubled by official doctors who asked questions. One such night, Eleanor watched as a girl named Margaret writhed with cramps so fierce she could barely breathe. Mrs. Harrow sent Jonah running, and hours later a small woman in a black shawl arrived, carrying a basket of herbs. She brewed a foul-smelling tea that made Margaret gag, then rubbed her stomach with oil until the pain eased. Before leaving, she pressed a warning: too much of this work will break the body. Rest if you value your life. Rest was a luxury the house could not afford. Eleanor recorded it in her notebook. We mend ourselves with shadows. We whisper cures like prayers. But the body does not forget even when the world insists it must. The midnight healers were not saints. They charged coin, sometimes dear coin. They gave remedies that worked and others that failed. A girl in another house once drank pennyroyal tea too strong and never rose again. The city buried her without name. The others whispered, mourned briefly, and returned to work. Still, the healers endured because they were necessary. They lived in the cracks between morality and survival, condemned by polite society but essential to those it condemned. One evening, Lily returned with a satchel of dried herbs. She handed Eleanor a sprig of lavender. For your pillow. To sleep without dreams. Eleanor pressed it to her face, inhaling the scent. It reminded her faintly of summers in Boston, before the fog and the rules and the ledgers. For a moment she felt like herself again. The midnight healers could not change the world. They could not erase the bargains struck under gaslight. But they gave women tools, however small, however dangerous, to wrest back a sliver of control over their own bodies. And in a city that demanded silence from them, even that sliver felt like defiance.